Okay, so we are live streaming. Hi, everyone out there on the internet. My name's Rosie. For anyone just joining, I'm the programming librarian here at the Thomas Crane Library. We have a fantastic program tonight. I'm very excited to hear from our speaker. So while I get that queued up, feel free to keep your cameras on or off throughout the presentation. We'll have a Q&A at the end. You can type your questions in the chat or come off mute by raising your hand, and I'll be monitoring that. But before we get into that, let's have our speaker. So tonight's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Thomas Crane Public Library. It's really my privilege to introduce our speaker, Nina Sankovitch. Nina Sankovitch is a best-selling author, an award-winning historian, and a voracious reader. And in addition to being profiled in the New York Times for her year of reading a book a day, she's also written for the New York Times, the LA Times, Vogue, the Huffington Post, many other media sources, and is also the author of 4 nonfiction books, with a 5th coming out next year, about the life of the Revolutionary era non-gendered minister fighting to save the soul of America. Tonight, Nina will talk about her book, American Rebels, how the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy families fanned the flames of revolution, focusing on the forgotten story of Josiah Quincy Jr., rebel leader, diplomat, lawyer, and prolific pamphleteer. But I'm going to kick it over to Nina. If anyone has any questions, please say them for the end. But go ahead, Nina.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always happy to speak to library audiences, and especially this library means a lot to me. This town obviously means a lot to me, given the book that I wrote. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Uh-oh. Oh, here it is. Hang on. Okay. Uh-oh. Now let's see how that's going to work. Okay. There we go. That's working now. Am I right or not? Wait, let me move that. Sorry.
No worries.
There we go. Is that working now? It is, right?
That looks fantastic.
Okay, good. It's been a while since I did this, but here we are. So American Rebels, yeah. Tonight, as you heard, I want to talk to you about Josiah Quincy. He's really a forgotten hero of the American Revolution. And pretty much everywhere I go, when I bring up Josiah Quincy, people say, who is that? And I don't think that happens in Quincy or in Braintree, but it does happen. And I hope that my book, American Rebels, does something to remedy that situation. I really think that Americans need to know about Josiah Quincy Jr. And all that he did in the years leading up to the American Revolution. In my book, American Rebels, I write about other members of the Quincy family and also the Hancock family and the Adams family. My book follows the intertwining lives of 5 young people from these families, but also their parents, their uncles, their aunts, their cousins, and really tries to answer, and I think it does answer, a question that I had for just years, which is, how did the American colonists have the courage to rise up against England? And I wondered how that desire for independence and for freedom and to start a new nation, how that cut across class lines and how it cut across gender lines. And so I was really looking for a community to study in which there were a lot of patriots, but also some loyalists, and from different kinds of families and male and female. And I found all that in the old village of Braintree. I could not believe, actually, when I found out, here I've got a slide of old Braintree. There we go. Oh, this is, okay, let me change this just a little more. Uh-oh, got a problem. Let me just fix this screen one more time. Okay. I was surprised that so many people that I'd heard of, not Josiah Quincy, because when I first started this book, I hadn't heard of him, but I was surprised that so many people had really grown up in the small village of Braintree. So we have John Adams and Abigail Adams. You know, John Adams, of course, grew up in Braintree. And Abigail Adams spent a good part of her childhood in Braintree as well. She stayed with her grandmother, grandmother Quincy, because her grandmother really appreciated the kind of young girl she was. She was very strong-minded, very energetic. And while her parents wanted her to behave in a more ladylike fashion and in a way more even someone who was the daughter of a minister, the grandmother said, well, wild colts make the best horses, meaning that kind of energy and enthusiasm and drive that Abigail has is going to serve her well. And in fact, that did turn out to be true. John Hancock also grew up. Part of his childhood was spent in Braintree until his father died, and then he was adopted by his uncle, wealthy Thomas Hancock, who moved the boy to Boston. But his childhood friends were John Adams and Josiah Quincy, who I'm going to talk about tonight, Josiah Quincy's older brothers. And John Hancock, of course, married a Quincy, Dolly Quincy, grew up in Braintree. In my book, I write about their very long courtship, and I explore the reasons why it was such a long courtship. And I don't have time to go into that tonight, but it is an interesting story, why it took these two so long to finally get married. And then why did they choose to get married in 1775? John Hancock was, there were all kinds of threats against his life. The British wanted nothing more than to find him, arrest him, hang him. And yet he went and had a fairly public marriage in the village of Fairfield, which is right next door to where I live. So that's an interesting story, but for another evening. Dolly Quincy's father was Edmund Quincy. And this portrait is actually from the Dorothy Quincy house there in Quincy. And I just love this portrait. I love Edmund Quincy. He was just such a character. He wrote letters, pages and pages long, giving advice to anyone and everyone. Ben Franklin, his daughters, anyone he met, he gave a lot of advice, and always very good-tempered guy. His fortunes went up and down and up and down, but he stayed steady through most of it. His brother was, here we go, Josiah Quincy Sr., and that is Josiah Quincy's house. And the reason I have a picture of that house, and I'm sure you've all been there and seen that house, it's there in Quincy, is that George Washington actually asked him to spy from that third floor little area there, to spy in Boston Harbor for him. So he was a patriot. His brother Edmund was a patriot. Interestingly enough, his son, Sam Quincy, was not a patriot. He was not necessarily a dyed-in-wool loyalist, but he didn't want there to be a war. He didn't want change. He had a good life under English rule. Here he is wearing actually the robe and wig of an English barrister. He served as as a prosecutor for the crown in the colony of Massachusetts. He lived a good life. He had money, a house on Beacon Hill. He had a good wife. It wasn't that he was so pro-king or so pro-parliament, but he definitely didn't want to rock any boats. He wanted things to just go along. Unlike his youngest brother, here we go, Josiah Quincy Jr., who I'm going to spend the rest of the evening talking about, and hopefully you've all become as fascinated with him as I am. In the 10 years leading up to the American Revolution, Josiah Quincy Jr. became known throughout the colony of Massachusetts, and really throughout other colonies as well, as the Patriot. The Patriot, that was the name given to him. He gained this name because he was the most impassioned and impassioning political writer of his time. He was not only a gifted writer, but he was also an eloquent orator. He was also a lawyer who took on all sorts of cases, which I'll get into, and he was a diplomat who traveled far and wide seeking American unity at home and abroad. He went, and I'll get to that. I shouldn't get too far ahead of myself, but he did travel far and wide seeking prosperity for Americans, peace for Americans, and all this despite his crippling health issues. So just all the way back to his childhood, Josiah suffered from very bad health. While the other kids in the village were out and about, playing in the fields and woods, Josiah was most often home in bed, resting his body, but letting his mind roam free through reading. He loved to read. From an early age, he was a voracious reader. He consumed volumes from the family library, the libraries of his uncles and aunts. And I have here a picture of a library you may know well. It's the library at Peaceville. That was John Quincy Adams' library. This is just the kind of library that he would like to just sink into and spend his day reading. At the age of 14, Josiah left Braintree to start college at Harvard. Here's old Harvard. His brothers, older brothers, Sam and Ned, had gone before him, as had fellow villagers John Hancock and John Adams. But in many ways, Josiah's experience would prove to be very different from that of his brothers. He was never a big drinker or carouser, unlike his brother Sam, who really took the crown, no pun intended, but took the crown for revelry, with John Hancock coming in a close second. They both had reputations for just all-night partying. According to an early historian of Harvard, the mid-18th century at the college was a time when, and I'm quoting here, two-fisted tippling was at its peak. At no other period in the history of the Cambridge institution has so much liquor been consumed per capita. I have a slide here of, this is from a collection at Harvard. This is just a tiny portion of a small fraction of the drinking vessels they have in their collection. These were used every day by the students of Harvard to tipple, and tipple they did. But not Josiah Quincy. He was not interested in drinking. He was a reader through and through, and in the copious notes he took in college of the reading that he did, we can see evidence that he not only read a lot, but he took these notes about his reading. He copied out favorite lines from books that he liked. And he would use those lines throughout his life in his own writings, in his own speeches. So these lines meant something to him, and he would go on to use them to mean something to other people. So this is how he organized his writing. He was so organized. Here's quotes about soldiers, about love, about power. Josiah's favorite books were the ones that explored the history of law and of legal systems, dating all the way back to the Greeks and Romans, and how such ancient systems influenced English common law, English government, and what he considered to be the best system of justice in the world, the courts of England, operating under the precepts and promises of the British Constitution. Here we have, this is a book by Bacon about English law. Entranced as he was by concepts of law and justice, there was no question that Josiah would become a lawyer. After graduating from Harvard in 1763, he began an apprenticeship under the careful watch of Oxenbridge Thatcher. Thatcher, like his young student, here we have Thatcher, was broadly educated, he was well-read, and he was obsessed with the law. And also, like Josiah, he was very progressive in his ideas about government, about society, and about the rights of all mankind under God and under law. In other words, Thatcher, like Josiah, was a devoted Whig politically, just like Josiah. They were both Whigs, and as was John Adams and John Hancock. Now, what are sort of the ideas of the Whigs? What drove Josiah Quincy to become the way he was politically, to become such a believer in the rights of colonists in America? Well, human reason, individual liberty, universal rights, these are the hallmarks of Whig thought, and really the backbone of both Josiah and Oxenbridge Thatcher's legal and political convictions. And we will see that in the writings, in the actions. Everything that Josiah did in his life is based on his very firm ideals, not only about human reason and individual liberty and universal rights, but he also had a very strong faith. He believed very much in God. Some of the founding fathers believed in God, but were not as firmly in their faith the way Josiah was. He felt that God was directing things in the colonies, and that the colonists had to follow through on what were the rights that God had given them, that it was almost a duty, a religious duty, to follow through and ensure that your political rights were protected. Anyway, Thatcher and Josiah Quincy became very close. And when Thatcher died in 1765 of complications from a smallpox inoculation, he left his entire practice to young Josiah Quincy, just in his mid-20s. Josiah then did something which would soon become a custom throughout the colony, but at the time was a novelty. He hung a shingle outside his office announcing his profession as lawyer, and announcing that he was a lawyer for hire. Come on in, I can help you with your problems. When Josiah had begun working with Thatcher, he'd put away his diaries where he kept notes on books that he read, the college diaries that he had. And he started keeping a journal that he called his Law Commonplace book. So here it is. Here is the first volume of his Law Commonplace book. And he wrote on the cover of that book a quote from David Hume. From law arises security, from security, curiosity, and from curiosity, knowledge. So what does that mean? It means that to have a society where people can flourish and prosper, where they can educate themselves and improve themselves, you have to have law and order. You have to have that calm law and order so that in that peace, people can flourish. In a chaotic regime, there can be no flourishing of people, in Josiah's opinion. So to him, law and order was important as a way to really help everyone in the colony reach their potential, reach their economic potential, their social potential, because they would be protected by law and order. They could be sure that the law applied to them as it applied to their neighbor. It was fair and equal. In his Law Commonplace book, Josiah organized the cases that he witnessed or participated in or read about. And here's an example of how he organized those cases. Everything from domestic law to contract law to criminal proceedings he wrote about. In the side notes, he would offer his own analysis of how the cases that he had witnessed or participated in, how decisions had been made by judge or jury in those cases. And he would analyze whether the right or wrong decision had been made. Now, in many ways, his Law Commonplace book provided what would become Harvard Law School's famous Socratic method of teaching law, this questioning and analyzing every step of a legal decision to understand how the correct or incorrect decision had been reached. Josiah's law journals served him well in the years that followed after Oxenbridge Thatcher's death, as he built up his law practice. But not only as a lawyer, those law journals also helped him in the new role that he took on after Thatcher's death. He basically took over the role that Thatcher had played in the colony, which was of a political pamphleteer, kind of a talking head of the times. Josiah became the talking head, the Whig talking head of Massachusetts, and he wrote a lot. He wrote pamphlets and speeches and letters and shared them widely. And he was really, he would really go on to take part in and lead through his political writing and through his political leadership in some of the most important events leading up to the American Revolution. So he didn't just write about things, he got actively involved in the events that were unfolding in Massachusetts in the years leading up to the American Revolution. For example, after the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, Josiah spearheaded the rhetorical campaign against the British tax plan. He instigated the nonviolent measures that would lead to its downfall. So he wrote against it, but he also came up with a plan of how it could be defeated in a nonviolent way. The act had been passed, the Stamp Act had been passed because England was out of money. And the colonies were the place to find needed funds. Now, Josiah was by nature and training impelled to look at the situation from both sides. He understood why the British needed to raise money. They had emptied the royal coffers fighting the 7 Years' War, and England was now broke. Okay, but the measures taxing the colonies had been enacted by Parliament without the protections of representation and process guaranteed by British law. It was this failure to follow legal precedent, to follow the law, that Josiah could not abide. Parliament had trampled on the colonists' rights, and such trampling could not stand. As I said earlier, Josiah revered the British system of law and justice and government. In his opinion, the British Constitution, and this is how he described it, as the best asylum, the glorious medium for safeguarding human rights and human dignity. Now, England does not have a constitution like we do where everything's written down. Their constitution is really composed of all accepted law in England, including the Magna Carta, the 1689 Bill of Rights, Acts of Parliament, court cases, legal conventions. All of that makes up the British Constitution. Now, in Josiah's opinion, this whole connected weaving in of all these different precedents and laws, that it really was the best system in the world in terms of promoting private and public rights and guaranteeing freedom for all. But when that constitution was violated, he thought it was perfectly proper to rise up and protest against it. Not take up arms, not storm a Capitol, no, but to come up with a way to protest the act. And the way that he and the other Sons of Liberty came up with was a boycott. Josiah urged that a boycott would be the most effective way to hurt England. And if England was hurt economically, they would withdraw the tax plan. Now, the colonists had to make big sacrifices to participate in this boycott, because the Stamp Act, what it did is it required that those stamps be bought and paid for anything purchased involving any kind of paper. So it included writing papers, stationery, cards, books, legal papers. And the Stamp Act also applied to any activities requiring certain papers. For example, a wedding license. So many colonists decided, okay, we will hold off on getting married. We are going to make it hurt. We're not going to support in any way the Stamp Act. And it was hard. It was hard on the colonists. No doubt about it. But the economic toll which the boycott took on merchants and suppliers in England was much worse. Now, I'm not really sure how the wedding thing played out for being bad for the merchants, but it's more like building up a real sense of resistance, like we're in this all together. I'm not even going to get married until the Stamp Act is gotten rid of. So in the end, the boycott was successful and Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Now, of course, that was not the end of it, and Josiah Quincy was well aware that would not be the end of it, that more acts would be coming down the pike. But he had seen how the colonists could act together, how they could act together in nonviolent ways to oppose the regime, and that this is what they wanted to do. They had the will to fight for their rights, and he was really heartened by that. He knew that within his colony, and he began to see evidence in other colonies, that there was a will to really stand up for rights, and that made him happy. Now, the success of Josiah's political activism came at a cost. As I said earlier, he was suffered from ill health really his whole life, and the hours spent attending meetings of patriots and composing pamphlets, while also working as a lawyer, it took its toll on his health. And he finally went to go see a doctor to really get a diagnosis of what was ailing him. I mean, he'd been to see doctors, but the diagnosis was finally made, which was that Josiah had consumption. Now, consumption was a harrowing condition. And really, there was no cure for consumption. Now, of course, we know it's as tuberculosis, and you take antibiotics, and you can survive tuberculosis. Symptoms of consumption included weight loss, night sweats, fevers, being very, very tired, and perhaps worst of all was coughing up, blood and phlegm. And Josiah could go for weeks without any of these symptoms and feel pretty normal, maybe a little tired, but feel pretty normal. And then all of a sudden, the symptoms would come up again. Now, many were treated for consumption with bleeding and purging, which really made no sense because that only made you more weak. And Josiah did not want to do that. So he went to go see a young doctor by the name of Dr. Joseph Warren. He was just 3 years older than Josiah, as I said, a young man, but he was already a well-respected doctor and a leading patriot, fellow Whig, and he advised Josiah that to rest was important, but also to take in a lot of fresh air, to eat well, because one danger of consumption is you kind of waste away. And he's told Josiah, avoid any late nights at taverns. And Josiah said, no, that's not my issue. I stay up late working, but I never stay up late drinking. A recurring theme throughout Josiah Quincy's political writings and in his private journals and his correspondence, and I've already talked about this, so you won't be surprised, but really his strongest ideal is adherence to the rule of law. And the ideals of justice based on equal application of the law guided his every move. A test of his convictions came in 1770, when Josiah was asked by the British Army captain Thomas Preston to defend Preston and his men against multiple charges of murder. I'm sure you are all familiar with what the colonists called the Boston Massacre and the British called an incident on King Street. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, what began as a taunting of a guard by a child turned into the gathering of a mob and ended with British soldiers blindly shooting into a crowd of civilian men, women, and children. 3 men were killed that night, another died the next morning, and another man died 2 weeks later. Captain Preston and 7 British soldiers under his command were charged with murder in the deaths. Captain Preston sent a message through his jailers that he wanted Josiah Quincy to take his case. Why Josiah? Because he was known as the best lawyer in all of Boston. Now, Josiah wanted to take the case because he said, and I quote, this is a quote from Josiah, "Criminals charged with murder are not yet legally proved guilty, and therefore, however criminal, are entitled by the laws of God and man to all legal counsel and aid." Even more importantly, Josiah believed that by providing the best counsel to Preston and his soldiers, the American patriots in Massachusetts could prove to the king and to Parliament that Massachusetts was a law-abiding and responsible colony and deserved to have all of its rights to govern itself and govern its and take care of its courts and tax itself. All of those rights should be restored to it. The right to control its own economy without interference from England. Josiah asked John Adams to join him in defending Preston and his men, and John Adams eagerly agreed. Now, the irony is that the prosecutor in this case was Josiah Quincy's brother, Samuel, the loyalist, who was the prosecutor for the crown. And so it was his case to bring against these men. So the 2 brothers faced off against each other, one defending men whom he viewed as agents of an oppressive regime, and the other prosecuting men whom he viewed as the good guys who were there to help keep the colony under British control. But they both agreed that the trial of Preston and the soldiers was an important visual for the world. Massachusetts must show itself to be a just and fair place. And when I say show it to the world the world of between America and England and that world, they were watching. Everyone was watching in the colonies, overseas in England. They were watching what was going on with these trials. And Josiah knew that. And he was very careful in how he presented the case to the jury, how he questioned witnesses, because he knew everything he said was being recorded and then being reported on and sent out to the world. So we actually have very good historical record of what went on at that trial because it was so carefully watched. Now, Josiah wanted from the very start to impress upon the jury members the gravity of their role in providing justice to the accused. So, this is a jury of colonists. Now, of course, some of them are going to be pro-king, but many of them were not. And Josiah wanted to make sure they understood it wasn't their role to be political on this jury. It was their role to listen to the evidence. And he said, and I'm going to quote from the record, "Permit me, gentlemen, to remind you of the importance of this trial as it relates to the prisoners. It is for their lives. An opinion has been entertained by many among us that the life of a soldier is of very little value, of much less value than others of the community." Josiah paused and then continued. "The law, gentlemen, knows no such distinction. The life of a soldier is viewed by the equal eye of the law as estimable as the life of any other citizen." And so the trials unfolded. First, the trial of Captain Preston, and then the trials of the men who had served under him. Throughout the proceedings, Quincy continued to remind the jury of their duty. Josiah Quincy. He knew that his words were being reported, as I said, and his message was not only to the men on the jury, but to all the people of the colony. "You are not sitting here as statesmen or politicians," he told the jury. "You ought to be careful to give a verdict which will bear the examination of time, when the pulses which now beat shall beat no more." Well, Captain Preston and 5 of his soldiers were found not guilty of murder, and 2 were convicted of manslaughter. They were condemned to be branded on the hand. Josiah and John Adams were satisfied they'd done their job well. Samuel Quincy was attacked from all sides for prosecuting the case and for losing it, but he found solace in believing that he had stayed true to his ideals and his role as prosecutor. Now, in addition to Josiah's work as political agitator and as a lawyer fighting for justice, he also took on the role of diplomat in his fight for the rights of colonists. He took whatever opportunity came to him to bring new voices from across America into the fold of liberty, including opportunities afforded by his own illness. When late in the year of 1772, Josiah suffered a terrible relapse of consumption, and his doctor Warren suggested that he travel to the warmer weather of Charleston, South Carolina, for a few months to rest. Josiah agreed to go. But rest and relaxation were not his primary intention. Instead, he would use the trip to begin a one-man campaign to understand and corral the political interests of the Southern colonies, with the end goal of binding the interests of the South to the interests of the North. Now, you could say that the most important work of Josiah's life came about because of his recognition, first, that the Southern colonies were very different from the Northern colonies, and second, that the only way Americans could achieve their objectives of justice and liberty was if all the colonies worked together, if they joined in a union of opposition to British policies, and if necessary, to British rule. So how were the Southern colonies different from the Northern ones? Well, first and foremost, Southerners were wealthier than Northerners. And their social structure was more similar to England, with the higher class of the wealthy, educated landowners and merchants essentially running the show for everyone else. for the labor, small farmers, artisans, clergy. In other words, the wealthy plantation owners and merchants lived like kings and ruled colonial politics. Now, all the colonists, North and South, had a much higher standard of living, really, than the citizens in England did, or in Europe for that matter. It was just a higher standard of living because there was plenty of food to eat. There was good, healthy atmosphere. People weren't all crowded in together. There was plenty of wood in the winter to keep your house warm. The colonists were taller than the Englishmen or Europeans because they had a healthy lifestyle and healthy food and plenty to eat. But the wealthy families of the South lived lives of luxury and of leisure far beyond anywhere else in America. The first American millionaire was a South Carolina planter and lawyer, and 9 of the 15 wealthiest American estates based on non-human assets in the years leading up to the Revolution were in the South. When counting human assets, such as Black enslaved persons and indentured servants, Southern wealth went even further in surpassing that of the North. Almost 50% of the total wealth of all the American colonies was held in the South, with the middle colonies in New England dividing the rest. Now, the crops which provided this great profit to planters and merchants were tobacco, rice, indigo. Rice and indigo required more labor than tobacco, and at first planters relied on indentured servants to supply that labor, more than on enslaved persons. Even the first Black slaves brought to Jamestown in 1619 were treated as indentured servants. They were allowed to work for their freedom. But as opportunities in England and Europe improved, fewer immigrants wanted to come as indentured servants to America. And Southern plantation owners and planters in the North turned to slavery to supply the labor that they needed. Now, slavery, of course, was an established institution already in the Caribbean and other areas in the Western Hemisphere. And the sale of enslaved persons to American colonies in the years before the Revolution constituted only 6% of the world's slave trade. Nevertheless, the number of enslaved persons in the American colonies grew rapidly in the mid to late 17th century. And by the time of the American Revolution, the colonies of Virginia and Maryland had a Black slave population of over 200,000, but in South Carolina, Black slaves made up 2/3 of the total population of the colony in 1775. So South Carolina led not only in how many slaves were owned, but also was the busiest in terms of Southern commerce and Southern wealth. Charlestown, later Charleston, was the center of it all. According to one researcher, the annual import-export trade in Charlestown before the war exceeded the port of New York, even though the population was half of what New York's was. So as home to many of the wealthiest and most influential political leaders of the South, Josiah Quincy knew that to go to Charleston, that was the place to go. That was the place to start his Southern journey and his quest to understand the South. He would start in Charleston. Now, there was already a patriotic fervor in the Southern colonies, but opposition to British rule in the South had begun more as a response to economic troubles than as concerns about political rights and freedoms. So many plantation owners were land rich but cash poor, and they relied on foreign creditors to get them through times when markets for their products suffered, either because of bad harvests or lukewarm demand. For example, when the Stamp Act was passed, at the same time that happened, the price and demand for tobacco was plummeting in England, and this hurt the Southern planters. So the planters and merchants were facing creditors who had begun calling in their loans at the same time the Stamp Act was issued. And so the Southern opposition to the acts was not only based on questions of taxation and representation, but also the egregious burdens that were being placed on their personal economies and the colony-wide economies. Josiah understood that. He understood the economic concerns. He also understood that the social structure was different in the South, that religion was treated in a different way. And yet he was sure that he could bring Southerners and Northerners together in a joint purpose of liberty. If he could just be there and talk to people, he was sure that that he could create a union, and then king and parliament might be more willing to back down from their demands on the colonies facing this joined opposition. And they might agree to address colonial grievances, and there may be no need for any war for independence, just a reconciliation with England, because England facing unified colonies would back down. Josiah wrote in a letter to a friend, "Let us forgive each other's follies and unite while we may. To think justly is not sufficient, but we must think alike before we shall form a union. If that union be truly formed, we are invincible." Josiah's father and his friends and his wife counseled against Josiah taking this trip to Charleston. To travel by the sea during the winter was very dangerous. In fact, Josiah's older brother, Ned, who had also suffered from consumption in 1768, had taken a journey to the South for the purpose of healing from his consumption. And he went down in shipwreck and he died. So Josiah's father was very worried about Josiah going. There was always, what was interesting, I found out, is there already existed at that time in 1770s, the curse around Bermuda, the Bermuda Triangle, that the waters were that many a ship went down in the waters, and Josiah would have to go right by there to be able to get to Charleston. And he was determined to go. He said, "I'm going." And in early February of 1773, he set off by boat for Charleston. Now, during the journey, there were moments when he thought, "Oh my gosh, my father was right," because storm after storm hit that vessel. Josiah described it. He said, "The waves seemed to curl with flames. The sky was black and heavy. The seas rise in wrath, and mountains combat heavens. Clouds engage with clouds. Thunders roll and oceans roar." It was not until the end of March that Josiah's family finally received word that Josiah was alive, that he'd made it to Charleston safely. He wrote to them and he said, "I had actually really feared for my life. I had not the least expectation of ever seeing you again. I was fully convinced we must perish. But now he had landed and all was good." He said, "My health is good. Everything looks favorable at present," he wrote. And he also in his letter wrote about the trade, riches, magnificence, and great state of Charleston, and of how impressed he was by the beauty of the town. In grandeur, splendor of buildings, decorations, equipages, commerce, shipping, and indeed in almost everything, it surpasses all I ever saw or ever expect to see in America. So Josiah threw himself headlong into getting to know the people of the South, their ways, manners, proclivities, political inclinations. He took part in luncheons and dinner parties, sightseeing tours by carriage, and afternoons on horseback. And the rich and powerful men of Charleston just quickly warmed to him. They loved him. He was savvy, cultured, interested in good food and wine. And good wine was to be had everywhere. Josiah wrote in his diary about one evening when he enjoyed "the richest wine I ever tasted, exceeds Mr. Hancock's in flavor, softness, and strength." But Josiah did not really enjoy all the socializing. He wrote in his diary how he didn't enjoy having to endure the gaiety and dissipation of the Southerners. And he noted with disdain that cards, dice, the bottle, and horses engrossed prodigious portions of time and attention in the South, along with billiards, dogs, and spirits. Nevertheless, he was heartened by finally meeting up with and making connections with patriots, active patriots, who he described them as hot and zealous in the cause of America. He felt that real friendships could be formed. He met Cornelius Hartnett and wrote about how from perfect strangers we became intimate. We found an apparent affection, and at parting, both seemed to be mutually and alike affected. Now, not everyone that he met became a close friend. He faced opposition while traveling in the South. He was even challenged to a duel by a loyalist Southerner who accused Josiah of being a windbag. When offered a dueling pistol, Josiah fainted, and the Southerner claimed that this is just further proof of what a weakling he and all the other Northerners were. But overall, Josiah found enough men to really feel like, yes, there are patriots in the South, and we can form connections with them, and we can form a union. So he had relationships with men who would go on to play roles, important roles at the Continental Congress. Thomas Lynch from South Carolina, William Hooper of North Carolina, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina, Charles Carroll of Maryland, who would actually be the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Smith, Joseph Reed, John Dickinson. Now, William Hooper had actually been raised in New England, educated at Harvard, may even have known Josiah there. And it was one of those people who had been a loyalist, but then changed and became a patriot, and he formed a strong relationship with Josiah Quincy. So much so that when Josiah returned to Massachusetts, finally in late spring, he was certain that the groundwork had been laid for the alliances that we would see play out at the First Continental Congress. But Quincy also identified a huge obstacle to a long-term successful alliance between North and South: slavery. Slavery was that obstacle. It was a central component of Southern life and culture, and Josiah abhorred it. He found the practice of slavery evil. He was horrified by its prevalence throughout the South. He was disgusted by how so many leaders of the Southern colonies accepted the slavery of others without question. He feared that the necessary eradication of slavery would be very difficult because he knew there would be opposition from the South. He correctly predicted, he wrote about in his journal while traveling through the South, he correctly predicted resentment, wrath, and rage would occur between the colonies over slavery. And he wrote, "Slavery may truly be said to be the peculiar curse of this land. The brutality used toward enslaved persons, the laws controlling them, will stand as eternal records of the depravity and contradiction of the human character. These are but a small part of the mischief of slavery. New ones are every day arising. The future will produce more and greater problems." Josiah, of course, was right in his prediction about slavery. During the debate over ratification of the Declaration of Independence in the early summer of 1776, the Southern colonies' dependence upon slavery destroyed any hope of abolishing its practice under the colony's platform for independence. Thomas Jefferson had included language in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence that would have abolished slavery and which condemned King George for promoting slavery. But Southern colonies, really led by South Carolina and Georgia, refused to allow that draft of the Declaration of Independence to go on. They insisted that that language be excised. And in order to have a Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson finally agreed to removal of the language about abolition. And we are dealing with the legacy of that removed language still today, as predicted by Josiah Quincy. So you may ask, where was Josiah during these negotiations at the Continental Congress over the language of abolition in the Declaration of Independence? Well, by the summer of 1776, Josiah Quincy was dead. He had returned home from his Southern journey in the late spring of 1773, feeling good, feeling strong in health and high in spirits, and he was sure that a strong union could be presented against British oppressions, and he was even sure that war could be averted. But then Britain passed the Tea Act, which is basically a monopoly, gave the East India Company an exclusive right to supply tea to the colonies. And the colonists said, well, what's next? You're going to take over all of our economy. So New Englanders rose up in protest, as did the other colonies. And this was proof that Josiah's groundwork was producing fruit. Throughout the South, there were also boycotts of tea. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney vowed that tea shipped to Charleston would never be allowed to land. And of course, the same thing happened in Boston. And we all know this story. On the night of December 16th, 1773, Josiah delivered a speech before a packed crowd at the Old South Meeting House. Oh, there it is. in Boston, a speech that would propel the men and women of Boston for once and for all onto the path of rebellion. Now, almost 7,000 people were gathered that night, and they heard Josiah rise up from the balcony and give a speech about all the oppressions suffered by the colonists. Now, Harrison Gray, a wealthy merchant and loyalist who was in the crowd, he interrupted Josiah and warned him, "You're speaking treason." Well, Josiah said back to Harrison Gray, "If the old man on the floor intends by his warning to utter only a friendly voice in the spirit of paternal advice, I thank him. But if his object be to terrify and intimidate, I despise him." Then he went on, giving his speech, listing all the oppressions, and just as he was finishing up, he noticed a group of men had entered the hall, all dressed as Mohawk Indians. Just want to briefly explain the symbolism of the Mohawks for colonists. They were a symbol of strength and determination, largely due to their ferocity fighting in the 7 Years' War. So to dress as a Mohawk, therefore, was to demonstrate bravery, fearlessness, ruthlessness, and it put fear in those who saw the Sons of Liberty dressed in this way. Now, having spotted the men dressed as Mohawks, Josiah knew that the plan he and other patriots had come up with to fight the Tea Act would now unfold. The plan was simple. The tea and the cargoes of the ships at anchor in the harbor of Boston was going to be launched bale by bale into the freezing waters of Boston Harbor. There would be no unloading of cargo for sale and no payments of duty and no capitulation to Parliament. "I see the clouds which now rise thick and fast upon our horizon," Josiah said, his voice rising. "To that God who rides on the whirlwind and directs the storm, I commit my country." With those words, Josiah fell back in his seat while a crowd of thousands swarmed from the meeting house, following the men dressed as Mohawks down to Boston Harbor. All in all, it took about 60 men, little more than 3 hours, to break open 342 chests and dump over 92,000 pounds of tea into the sea. By early May of 1774, the colonists of Boston learned of Parliament's response. They shut down the port of Boston, said, "Until you pay us back all the money that was lost when that tea was thrown overboard, no goods are coming into your harbor." So basically, the people of Boston were to be starved into submission. Within days of receiving the Boston Port Act, just a couple days, Josiah Quincy published an 82-page critique of the act. And that pamphlet was circulated widely, and in it, he reminded his fellow colonists, "Nothing glorious is accomplished, nothing great is attained, nothing valuable is secured without devotion of heart to service. Dedicate yourself at this day to the service of your country, and henceforth live a life of liberty and glory." And Josiah decided it was time for him to once again play diplomat and go across the sea, this time to England. He was sure that the king just did not even realize what was really happening in the colonies. Now, of course, it took months for news to travel back and forth between the colonies and England, and Josiah and many of the other colonists were sure that the king and even members of Parliament were not getting the full story of what was really going on in the colonies. So he wanted to be the one who's going to set them straight and avert war. He sets sail for England, arrives early November 1774, makes his way to London, finally meets Benjamin Franklin. They become good friends. Josiah trusts him implicitly, and Franklin tries to help Josiah as he goes about, tries to get meetings with the king, with members of Parliament, but things do not go so well. There are politicians who say one thing to Josiah and then go right into Parliament and do something completely different. And he met people who supported the colonist cause, but they just didn't have enough power to do anything about it. I think what depressed Josiah most of all was King George. For so long, Josiah and other New Englanders had believed that their sovereign would listen to them, that he would be eager to know the truth of what was going on in America, and that he would support them in their petitions for fair treatment. And instead, Josiah found that King George was just as dogmatic in his opinions against the colonists as was his prime minister, Lord North. The final blow to Josiah's withering hopes for reconciliation came at the end of January 1775, when Parliament voted against measures that would have withdrawn troops from Boston, opened the port, gotten everything going again, and allowed the hearing and resolution of pro-America petitions, both from those in England and from colonists who had petitions to send to Parliament. So things were not looking good. And then Josiah's consumption came back. And he became ill again. Yet he still continued to try to have meetings, and he met with allies that were supporters of the American cause, and he met with other Americans, including two American brothers, William and Arthur Lee. And they agreed with Josiah. The only way forward was absolute independence from England. So at this point, Josiah is no longer interested in reconciliation. He wants independence. And the only way to win independence was for the colonies to fight for it. Josiah believes that now. He wrote in a letter to his wife, "Our countrymen must seal their cause with their blood." Josiah wanted to get this message of unified fighting, unified rising up against England. He wanted to get the message to his countrymen that they had to stand strong, had to stand together. But if he'd written any letters, they would have been opened up, and he would have ended up in prison in England, and he just didn't know what to do. Should he go back to America himself? And Josiah's doctor and Ben Franklin said, no, you stay here and get better. But the Lee brothers and some other radicals encouraged him to go. They told Josiah that they had secret information which could help the colonists, including information about potential allies in England. So Josiah wrote in his journal that the Lee brothers insist my going now will be of great advantage to the American cause. So on March 4th, 1775, Josiah Quincy Jr. boards a ship in Plymouth, England, bound for America. He carried with him secret information that could help the colonists in the fight for their rights. The information was so potentially treasonous and so dangerous that it could not be committed to paper, nor did Josiah record any details in his journal. The plans were only to be revealed when he arrived in America and could speak to his fellow patriots in person. Well, the weather on the journey back to America, this is November now, when we're in March now, and the weather was terrible. Every day more miserable. Water is rough, wind hard, air wet and cold, and his consumption is raising. He can't even go above board to get fresh air because it's too dangerous to go above board. So he's stuck in this putrid atmosphere of his cabin. But finally, April 26, 1775, the ship comes within view of the American coast. 7 days earlier, the battles of Lexington and Concord had been fought. But Josiah knew nothing about that. He had no idea that the colonists had held their own against the British, and that he had been right. The path to war was now inevitable, and the Americans could do it. They could fight the British. Josiah died that night, April 26th, on board the ship. He never set foot in America again. And we will never know what that final message was, that secret information he had been charged to deliver to fellow patriots. All that died with him. 1 year later, as the delegates to the Continental Congress debated the issue of slavery, Josiah was not there to rally the fight to end slavery in America for once and for all. Perhaps his oratory skills, the alliances he had made with Southerners, the friendships he had formed with so many Southerners, and just his plain old determination, as well as his skill at dealing with people, could have prevented the excision of Jefferson's paragraph about abolishing slavery, could have prevented that language from being excised out of the Declaration of Independence, could have ended the practice of slavery in America. Josiah might have been able to change the course of our nation's history, but we will never know. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was fantastic. Oh Oh my God, I learned so much.
Oh, good. Yay. That's great.
As someone that's new to Quincy, I was like, oh, this is fascinating. For anyone that's interested, we have many of Nina's books in our collection, both online and in person. I'd love to just open it up for 5 minutes if people would like for any questions. Feel free to either write one in the chat or raise your hand. But just first of all, thank you so much, Nina, for your time, because that was fantastic.
Of course.
I'll open the floor to any questions otherwise. Some people are a little worried about asking the first question. I've been there. I'm happy to break the ice. I was curious. I know that you didn't necessarily grow up in Massachusetts. So was there like a class that you took or maybe a book that you read that got you interested in this time period?
Really, every book that I've written has kind of led to the next book that I wrote. So before writing American Rebels, I wrote a book about the Lowells of Massachusetts. So why did I write that book? Because before that, I wrote a book about the history of letter writing, and just how since the ancient Egyptians, letter writing has been something that human beings did to connect with each other, to express thanks to each other. And in my book, I go through all different letters from all different kinds of people. And I wanted to include the letters of Amy Lowell because she was a poet that I'd liked really since I was a child. And it horrified me to discover that she had put as part of her will that all of her letters should be burned upon her death. I was like, why would someone do that? Why would they destroy their letters? Now, it turns out that, of course, only the letters that were in her control could be burned. So when I went out looking, because that's what they did, they literally put them on a bonfire. But when I went out looking for other letters, there's a huge collection of Amy Lowell letters. Anyway, it got me really interested in the Lowell family. So then I wrote the Lowell, Massachusetts, which made John Lowell, who was a patriot during the American Revolution, he stayed loyalist for a while and really only kind of at the last minute decided, no, I'm a patriot. I'm against rising up against England. So I'm for rising up against England. So that raised a question for me: what made a colonist decide to rise up? So that led to American Rebels. Sorry, long answer.
No, that was a fantastic answer. I personally like longer answers, and was also not even that long. But we have one question from the chat. I'll read it from Allison. Thank you, Allison, for your question. So Allison writes, how come John Adams gets the credit for getting Captain Preston found not guilty? How similar or different in their views on slavery, individual rights, etc. were they? It's a great question.
Yeah, it's really a two-part question. And the first part is John Adams stayed alive. And so John Adams' reputation became very important to the American story of how we became a nation and how we rose up against England. And he kind of was able to control the narrative of that story. And just, there are many wonderful things about John Adams. I admire him greatly, but he was very much concerned about what his reputation was, who he was, how people viewed him, and he controlled that as much as he could. So for him to be able to say, he very much put out this story. In later years, he wrote about the trial in a way that made it seem as if he was in charge of that trial. He was not. And if you look at the complete court record, you can see that it was Josiah Quincy who was instrumental, and it was Josiah Quincy who Captain Preston looked for first. Now, as for how similar or different were they, Abigail Adams was more in line with Josiah Quincy in terms of the rights of Blacks. John Adams would get there, but he was not the abolitionist that Josiah Quincy was, or that Abigail really was in her early years. We all know about Abigail wrote a letter telling John, remember the ladies, and the new government of the United States. And he laughed at that. And he certainly laughed at any idea that there would be an abolition of slavery. He was not willing to fight for that during the debate over the Declaration of Independence.
Really fascinating. I'll go over to Erin, who has her hand raised for the next question. Feel free to unmute, unless I need you to do that. Let's see.
There we go. I'm unmuted, yes?
Yes, I can hear you. Great.
I'm Quincy native and history teacher at Quincy High School. And not an expert by saying that. My students are actually working this year at the Dorothy Quincy Homestead, working on the script for the house, and we are working with a historian as well with that. And I know that the kids are talking about kind of looking into the lives of the servants and the slaves in the Quincy Homestead. And I didn't know this story about Josiah Quincy II and his instrumental, views with abolition. So I'm just interested in kind of the connection, because I know we talk a lot about the Edmund Quincy's EQs, lots of EQs,
Right.
and that we definitely had slaves in the household.
Yep.
So could you kind of put that in perspective, timeline wise, and how that connects?
Yeah. Edmund Quincy did have slaves. When he went bankrupt, what year is that? 1768. I'm not, sometime around then, he actually had to sell his slaves. So we do know, yes, he definitely had slaves. Josiah Quincy Sr., we don't have a record of him having enslaved persons in his household. And Josiah Quincy Jr. definitely didn't. John Hancock did have ones that he had inherited from his uncle when his uncle died, that he then later freed. I would say that Josiah Quincy was at the forefront of, he was definitely ahead of his time in terms of many people in his class did have household slaves. And he did not want them, and thought it was really an aberration. And this, he saw really, it was what, as I was talking about how important faith was to him, and he just could not reconcile having, this belief in God, and that God loved all men, all of his children, that you could not have another person, you couldn't own another person. He thought that was just abhorrent. He also was really disgusted by, when he was in the South, he saw a lot of children that had been fathered by masters, and that these men would just ignore these children and not free them, but allow them to live their lives as slaves. And he just couldn't understand how a man could have his own children be enslaved. So he was probably at the forefront of fighting against the institution of slavery. I think when he went south, it really struck him that how dangerous it was, especially to see how important it was to the Southerners that they hold down any kind of slave rebellion. I mean, I just found a fascinating book which talks about how the Second Amendment was actually more about arming people so that they could hold their slaves in terror, basically, have control over their slaves, than for any other reason. So Josiah anticipated all of these problems, knew that these were problems, and that's why he was so vehemently against the institution of slavery.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your questions. I really had such a lovely time. Nina, you're welcome back anytime. Whenever your next book comes out, that would be wonderful. But I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their night. Thank you again to the Friends of the Thomas Crane Library for sponsoring this program.
Yes,
Couple quick notes for anyone interested in our other upcoming programs. We're having on Friday an after hours at the library, an in-person program that instead of 1780s is 1980s themed, which we're excited for. There'll be a live band and a lot of 80s trivia, so that should be fun. Summer reading starting soon, but for everything that you need, just feel free to call us or go to our website. And thank you again, Nina, so much for your time. It was lovely meeting you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Friends of the Library. Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.